So let's take a look at why I'm saying that everything is a view. Well, when you look at this diagram here, you can see that we have a tree of views. And at the root, we have a view group, and that view group contains another view group and two views. And that second level view group contains views. So when you look at this structure, if you're familiar with a pattern here, a very common pattern in object-oriented development called the composite pattern, you should recognize that right off. And it indeed is a composite pattern. What's going on here is that we have a view group, and that view group is also a view itself. But view groups can contain children that are views. And since a view group is a view group can contain a child that is another view group, and so on and so forth. So this allows us to create a tree structure where we have view groups being nodes and views that are not of the view group type being leaves. It allows you to create a very complex UI and nest this entire structure. But the important thing to know here is that when we're looking at buttons, widgets, layouts, all the different things in Android, they're all essentially views, and they're part of this view tree. So let's look a little bit deeper into the architecture of a view. Well, when we use the word view in Android, we have to be a little bit careful because it's an overloaded word. What I mean by that is that in normal MVC frameworks, in normal perhaps ASP.NET development, you might have heard the word view and you think of that as the thing the user sees. It's pretty common definition that we've kind of grown accustomed to as MVC frameworks have become more mainstream. Well, in Android, we have to understand what do we mean by view, because view is being used in a lot of different contexts. The first meaning of view is the actual layout file. It's very common to say view is the same thing as the layout.xml files. The other thing that a view can be known as are individual widgets, like the button or a text view or any controls on the screen. Those are also implementing view, so they are technically views. And then the more common, the entire UI is a view. When we look at the screen and we see the buttons and display and the layout all together, we tend to call that a view. So when we use the word view, we need to understand what view are we talking about. Okay, also, we are not really dealing with an MVC framework. It looks a lot like it. A lot of the terminology is the same, and it's pretty close, and you can do MVC style development with Android. It's a little bit challenging unless you understand that you're not dealing with something that was designed to be an MVC framework. One of the ways that you would understand this to be true is that when you look at the activity, it's not really a controller. It appears to just be a controller, but it also contains a lot of the logic in displaying. So it really controls more of the view. It's kind of a controller view. The activity file, this is a very bad comparison, but it's kind of like a code behind file in an ASP.NET, an ASPX page. It's kind of like the code behind file, but it's not quite. It is a different thing. But it is also a point of control where when your application launches. If you remember in a previous module, we had talked about how activities are kind of sets of services, and they each have their own entry point. So it's a little bit different than MVC. You can do MVC. You can think a lot of the terminology of MVC when developing your Android applications, but just to keep that clear. And then one thing we should talk about is how that the activity draws the view. There's basically two ways you can design your interface, or you can use a view object, and you can programmatically construct a layout and add buttons to it and whatnot, or you can pass an XML layout file to your activity and it will draw that. So that lets you declare an XML file that describes your view. Now, of those two methods, I would highly recommend using the XML layout file. There's a couple of reasons for this. The main one being that it's going to give you a lot more flexibility. You can basically swap out your XML layout file based on different configurations or localizations. When in the module where we talked about the project structure of an Android application, we looked at how an Android layout file could exist in different resource file directories. And this is where this would come in handy, is if you need to make a completely different layout or lay out things a little bit differently for a different language or even for a different resolution of screen, you would be able to use the same activity but then use different XML files for your layout. Also, it's going to just be a little bit more modular. As much of the layout and type of things that you can separate from your code that does the logic, the better. It's going to make your code a lot simpler and easier to maintain.